There were 23 children in Elizabeth Crane's care. Not one of them has a grave. That is the sentence whispered in the corners of old Virginia taverns when the lamps burn low, when the air smells of pipe smoke and wet soil, when someone dares to recall the story they swore they'd bury with their own silence. It is not a sentence you find in court records or in church registers. It is not neatly written in the tidy script of county clerks. Instead, it drifts like ash on the wind, spoken in warnings, carved in the margins of lost journals, repeated by those who still feel the chill of that house upon their skin. Elizabeth Crane Silent Orphanage was no grand institution with bell towers and brick walls. It was a sprawling timber house, gray-beamed and narrow-windowed, set back from the muddy road that ran between Staunton and the Blue Ridge in the early years of the 19th century. From a distance it looked almost welcoming, a refuge for the forgotten children of a country still staggering from wars and loss. America was young then, raw, still carving itself from wilderness and graves. There were more orphans than homes, more wandering children than open hands to catch them. Men died on roads, women perished in childbirth. Disease swept through valleys without mercy. Orphanages and almshouses sprang up in barns, in abandoned taverns, in drafty houses that smelled of damp wood and boiled roots. And the Crane House, it became one of them. The year most often whispered is 1815. The war with Britain had just closed, the nation's attention pulled back from the smoke of burning capitals to the quiet desperation of its own children. Elizabeth Crane, a widow, with no surviving kin, presented herself as a charitable soul. She took in infants abandoned on church steps, children carried by strangers, brothers and sisters torn from disease-stricken farms. The records, such as they are, show no official charter, no sanction from the state, no church oversight. She simply opened her doors and the children came. 23 of them, according to the surviving fragments of ledgers and a single yellowed clipping from the Staunton Spectator. But when one asks where those children lie today, no one can answer. The Crane House itself has long since rotted back into the earth. Its timbers were scavenged, its hearthstone stolen, its roof fallen to moss. But the land remembers. Local men, before the war between the states, plowed the fields around that place. They claimed their horses balked at the soil, hooves refusing to touch ground that whispered. After the war, freedmen who sought to make a living there abandoned it by the second winter, muttering about voices in the fog and shadows in the rafters. By 1870, the house was a ruin, and by 1900 it had been swallowed by the forest. Today, only the stone steps remain, half-buried, leading nowhere. Yet the story of Elizabeth Crane endures because of what is missing. Orphanages, even the cruel ones, leave behind burial grounds. Children die, of fevers, of hunger, of cold, and are buried in crooked rows. There are always little graves marked with wood or stone, but there are none for the Crane children. Not a single mound, not a single cross, not even bones stumbled upon by hunters. The land yields nothing. It is here, in that silence, that the horror takes root. Some say Elizabeth Crane was a zealot, tangled in the fires of the Second Great Awakening that swept the region. She believed, perhaps, that the children were unclean, vessels, souls broken by the sins of their parents, needing purification by fire, by fasting, by silence. Others whisper she belonged to a smaller, darker sect that never proclaimed itself in open air. A gathering of purists, they called themselves, who believed God spoke loudest when children were broken of self. Rumors persist of ceremonies, where children were forced to kneel in icy streams until their bodies shook, or locked in cellars until they emerged with new tongues. And there is a third telling, that Elizabeth Crane was no religious woman at all, but a scientist of a most cruel persuasion. That in the years when doctors and natural philosophers experimented on cadavers, she experimented on the living. That her orphanage was not a home, but a hidden theater of the body, a place where scalpel and tincture turned children into subjects. The truth is swallowed by time, but fragments of evidence remain. In 1821, the Augusta County Court heard a case of trespass in which a farmhand claimed he had wandered near the Crane property and seen rows of pale children walking in the orchard, none speaking, their mouths bound by cloth. The case itself had nothing to do with her. It was dismissed as the ramblings of a drunk, but the testimony was preserved. In 1834, a traveling minister wrote in his diary of a strange house of children who sang no hymns, only low humming, as though their throats had been cut of song. He mentioned Elizabeth Crane by name. And then there are the orphan lists. The county kept rough ledgers of children placed in homes. In one such list, dated 1817, 23 names appear beneath E. Crane. They vanish from all subsequent records. The question is simple and damning. Where did they go? For the next hour, we will walk into that silence. We will trace the faint outlines of the Crane house, the whispers of her faith, the testimonies that survived fire and flood. We will listen to the voices of neighbors who swore they saw shadows in the orchard, and to the silence of earth that refuses to give up its dead. And perhaps if we listen long enough, we will hear the faint hum of those 23 voices that never found graves. Because in America's early years, there were places darker than any battlefield, and horrors that never made the history books. Elizabeth Crane's Silent Orphanage is one of them, and tonight, we enter. Elizabeth Crane did not appear remarkable in the fragments of description we have. The few who wrote of her described a woman of middle height, narrow in the shoulders with hair that never seemed to fall loose, always pulled tightly back, as if restraint itself were her doctrine. Her eyes were said to be gray and searching, her voice calm, her posture rigid as a gatepost. Some accounts insist she spoke little in public, yet when she did, people listened, not because of charm, but because of a quiet severity that suggested judgment had already been passed on them. She arrived in Augusta County sometime after 1808, according to tax records. Her husband, Samuel Crane, had fought in the Revolution and died in 1810 of what was listed simply as the fever. With no children of her own, Elizabeth's sudden decision to house orphans was, at first, seen as an act of noble charity. The county was drowning in children left unwanted, and she provided relief where the state could not. But charity, in that era, was not always free of shadow. Orphans were often placed in homes where they served as laborers, farmhands, or apprentices. Their care was measured in survival, not love. For Elizabeth Crane, however, the image she painted was not of industry, but of piety. She presented herself as a woman chosen for sacred duty, a vessel through which the forgotten might be purified. The sermons of the Second Great Awakening were echoing through Virginia in those years, preachers crying of damnation, of sin inherited, of the need for sanctification. It was in this fervent climate that Elizabeth carved her niche. Locals later claimed she spoke often of the stain of the bloodline, that children born of drunkards, convicts, or harlots carried within them an invisible taint. And that taint could only be burned away. Her orphanage, she insisted, was not merely a home but a crucible. The Crane house was built with strange features for a residence. Its cellar was unusually deep, lined with brick and fitted with iron rings in the walls, as though designed not for storage but for confinement. The windows of the upper rooms were narrow and high, preventing easy escape. A wide attic space, according to testimony given decades later, was sectioned into small cubbies, each no larger than a child's cot, with wooden shutters instead of doors. Elizabeth was not alone in her mission. Though no official church sanctioned her, she gathered a small circle of like-minded adherents, 4 women and 2 men, their names barely remembered, though a local census from 1819 lists them as residents of her household. They were widows, itinerant preachers, and a failed physician from Charlottesville named Dr. Nathaniel Prothero. Together they fashioned a doctrine that blended scripture with cruelty. One letter, preserved in a private collection and attributed to a neighbor named John Ruther, speaks of midnight hymns drifting from the house, though he swore no children's voices ever joined. Instead, he wrote, it was the sound of women chanting, low and droning, and of wood striking flesh, followed by silence. Ruther claimed he confronted Elizabeth once in the road, asking why the children were never seen at church. She smiled, he wrote, and replied, "The Lord's house has no room for what is unclean. They will enter his kingdom only when their tongues no longer betray them. That phrase, when their tongues no longer betray them, has fueled generations of speculation. Some believe she meant that the children were forced into vows of silence, broken of all speech. Others claim it hinted at something darker, mutilation, perhaps, or ritualistic cutting. In 1847, when travelers reported finding strange scratches carved into trees near the ruins of the Crane house, resembling symbols of open mouths crossed by lines, whispers began that the children's tongues had been cut to enforce obedience. No evidence remains, but the rumor has never died. Dr. Prothero's presence suggests another angle to the horror. He had been dismissed from the medical school in Philadelphia for unethical handling of cadaveric matter. In an era when dissection was both taboo and in high demand, some believed he sought living bodies for experimentation. A journal, fragment attributed to him, though its authenticity is debated, describes attempts to temper the humors of the young with tinctures and bleedings to rid them of inherited vice. If real, it reveals that Elizabeth's orphanage was not merely spiritual in nature, but experimental. The children were subjects, stripped of humanity, treated as clay to be reshaped. What is certain is that the community began to whisper. Farmers who passed the Crane property at dusk spoke of children walking in the orchard in pairs, heads bowed, never speaking. One peddler claimed he sold fabric at the house and saw children with wrists bandaged, their eyes sunken as if from long fever. Yet for all the rumors, no authority intervened. In those days, the lives of orphans were cheap, their fates unrecorded. As long as Elizabeth did not disturb the peace or beg alms, she was left alone. And so, behind the shuttered windows, her doctrines deepened. The Crane Circle held fast to the belief that silence was holy, that through silence, sin was driven out, that the voice was the gateway of corruption. The children, it was said, were forced to remain silent for weeks on end. Those who spoke were punished with days in the cellar or with fasting. Witnesses who later came forward described the sound of children's sobs muffled by cloth, as if even their crying was forbidden. One woman, an elderly servant who lived long enough to tell her story in 1859, spoke of seeing Elizabeth lead the children into the woods in white smocks, their mouths bound by linen strips. She claimed they were made to kneel in a circle while Elizabeth intoned scripture, her voice steady, the children rocking as if in trance. The woman refused to speak further, save to say, "They did not come back the same." These are fragments, whispers, testimonies filtered through decades of silence. But together, they paint the image of a house that was no orphanage at all, but a cloister of cruelty, a place where faith and science twisted into ritual, where children were stripped of voice, of self, of even their graves. And in that silence, that deliberate erasure, lies the most haunting truth. For to take a child's body is a crime. But to erase even their existence, to leave no mark upon the earth, is to kill them twice. Elizabeth Crane and her circle believed they were purifying the lost, but in doing so, they ensured those children would remain forever lost, neither remembered nor buried. And it is in that void, that absence, that the story festers. The next chapter of this tale reveals how the silence of the Crane orphanage began to crack, how neighbors grew uneasy, how travelers brought stories that could no longer be ignored, how the first accusations surfaced, and how whispers of missing children reached the ears of the county court. For a house can remain silent only so long, before the world demands to know what it hides. By the year 1820, Elizabeth Crane's house had taken on the air of a legend, even in its own lifetime. Neighbors avoided the crooked lane that led to her orchard, preferring to walk the long mile around rather than past the silent windows that never seemed to open. The house itself seemed to brood, its timbers darkening with mildew, its shutters nailed in place. The fields around it grew wild, never plowed, though children were often seen wandering them at dusk, pale shapes that melted back into the shadows when watched too closely. The first cracks in Elizabeth's veil of silence began with small disappearances. A boy named Isaac Whitfield, only 8 years old, was placed in her care by the county in 1816. His parents had died of typhoid, and he was left without kin. A clerk, dutiful in his role, noted his placement in a ledger, but when his elder cousin came seeking him 3 years later, no record could be found. Elizabeth insisted the boy had been sent to a farm in North Carolina, apprenticed to a cooper. The cousin, suspicious, pressed for details, but she offered none. The county made no inquiry. Isaac Whitfield was never seen again. Others followed. 2 sisters, Annabel and Ruth Dorsey, vanished from all known mention after being placed at the Crane house in 1818. A traveling minister who visited the property in 1821 noted that though Elizabeth claimed to house 24 children, he was only permitted to see 6, all of whom were mute and trembling, their eyes fixed to the floorboards as though daring not to look up. He later wrote in his diary, "The silence in that house was oppressive, thicker than air, and when I asked to hear the children sing, she replied, 'They do not yet deserve the gift of voice.'" Whispers began to reach the surrounding villages. Some claimed that the children who vanished had not been sent away, but rather buried beneath the orchard itself. Others swore that late at night, chants and drumming could be heard, punctuated by a single, high wail that carried on the wind. Before being cut short, the old roadman who passed through the valley told of seeing small white figures in the windows, staring without blinking, faces pale as wax. One particularly chilling account came from a tanner named Elijah Price. In 1822, he claimed to have stopped at the Crane property seeking water for his horse. Elizabeth, cool and composed, invited him to draw from the well, but as he leaned over the bucket, he heard a faint humming, not from the house, but from beneath the ground. It was rhythmic, many voices in unison, low and droning. He described it as the sound of children humming through soil. When he turned to ask Elizabeth what it was, her expression, he swore, held the faintest trace of amusement. "The earth carries their prayers," she told him. Price left at once. Never to return, rumors turned to fear. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the Crane house, whispering that Elizabeth might claim them too. A farmhand swore he saw one of the Crane girls at the edge of the woods, her mouth sewn shut with rough black thread. He was laughed at, dismissed as drunk, yet his story lingered. Others spoke of animals vanishing near the property, dogs, goats, once even a horse. All claimed the orchard soil bore no prints but the narrow impressions of bare feet. In 1824, a boy escaped. His name was Thomas Rigby, 10 years old, thin as a rail. He staggered into a farmhouse 6 miles from the Crane property, half dead, with fever. His wrists were raw from rope, his lips cracked and bloody. He spoke little at first, only muttering, "Quiet, quiet," until he was calmed. When at last he spoke plainly, his words chilled all who heard them. Thomas claimed the children were forbidden to speak, forbidden to cry, even forbidden to pray aloud. When they failed in their silence, they were taken to the cellar. There, he said, the walls echoed with chanting, not from the children, but from the adults who lived with Elizabeth. He described being locked in a wooden box for days, his mouth bound so tightly he could hardly breathe. He said that one girl who screamed was taken away to the orchard, and when she did not return, Elizabeth told the others she had been made pure. Neighbors reported the escape to the county magistrate, but Elizabeth denied it all. She claimed Thomas was deranged, touched by fever, and that he had never been in her care at all. Without records to prove otherwise, the magistrate dismissed the claims. Thomas, sickly and broken, died within months. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, his testimony fading into the whispers. Still, the murmurs grew louder. By 1825, the Silent Orphanage, as it came to be called, was spoken of with dread in the taverns of Staunton and the hills beyond. Travelers claimed to hear lullabies sung backwards, drifting from the chimneys. Hunters swore that the orchard trees bore strange marks on their bark, scratches that resembled children's faces, mouths open in silent screams. Some said that in the spring, the orchard bloomed white even when frost still clung to the valley, as if nourished by something deeper than soil. The local church grew uneasy. Reverend Jonathan Hale, a stern Presbyterian minister, raised the matter in his sermons, warning of a house that keeps children but not graves. His words stirred the congregation, but Elizabeth did not attend his services, and she was careful never to step outside the bounds of the law. Without proof, all talk of intervention dissolved into fear, but fear is a fire, and by 1827, that fire caught. A farmhand named Jacob Miller, drunk and emboldened, dared to sneak onto the Crane property one night. He claimed he wanted only to see for himself, to prove the tales were nonsense. What he found was worse than anything he expected. In the orchard, beneath the moonlight, he saw a ring of children kneeling in white smocks, their heads bowed, their mouths covered with cloth. Elizabeth and her circle stood around them holding candles. They spoke in unison, chanting words he could not understand. Then, one by one, they extinguished the candles, plunging the orchard into darkness. Miller fled, swearing he heard the muffled cries of the children behind him. When he told his story in the tavern, men laughed, women gasped, and the tale spread like wildfire. The Crane house was no longer simply a curiosity. It was a terror. Farmers refused to sell her grain. Mothers pulled their children closer when she walked the road. Elizabeth herself never faltered, her composure intact, her silence deeper than ever. But beneath that silence, pressure mounted. The law could ignore whispers, it could dismiss rumors, but when men swore they had seen with their own eyes, when voices grew louder, when fear became outrage, the county could not remain deaf forever. And so, in the winter of 1828, the first official inquiry was made. The sheriff himself arrived at the Crane property with 2 deputies, demanding to see the children. What they found that day was the beginning of the unraveling, a moment when the silence of 23 voices began to fracture. But what they discovered was not graves, nor laughter, nor even resistance. What they discovered was worse. The winter of 1828 was bitter in the Shenandoah Valley, the kind that cut the lungs raw and left frost clinging to the shutters of every farmhouse. Snow lay heavy on the road when Sheriff Matthew Yancey and his 2 deputies rode up the lane to Elizabeth Crane's house. The orchard trees stood bare and twisted, their limbs reaching like the hands of starved men. The sheriff later testified that no smoke rose from the chimney, though it was midday and the cold would have made the house unlivable without fire. He knocked once. The sound echoed, hollow, and after a long pause, the door opened. Elizabeth stood there in her plain black dress, her hair coiled tight, her expression unflinching. She asked no reason for their presence. Instead, she stepped aside, and with a faint smile said only, "The Lord welcomes those who come to test his work." Inside, the house was colder than the snow outside. The deputies described it as a place stripped of warmth, the hearth unlit, the air heavy with a sour odor, mildew, sweat, and something sharper. The sheriff demanded to see the children. Elizabeth nodded and led them through narrow halls into the main room. There, seated in 2 rows on benches, were the children. 16 of them, pale and motionless, their hands folded in their laps. Their eyes remained fixed downward, not daring to lift. None spoke, none cried, none moved but to breathe. Their faces were gaunt, their lips chapped and cracked. Some bore marks on their wrists as though from bindings. The deputies tried to coax words from them, but the silence was unbroken. The sheriff swore one boy's throat bore a crude scar, as if he had once been cut and poorly healed. When asked their names, not one answered. It was Elizabeth who spoke for them. "They are not yet clean," she said. "Their tongues have been bound to sin. In silence they find God." The sheriff demanded to see the others. Elizabeth replied that these were all who remained, though county records still listed 23 in her care. When pressed on the Missing 7, she smiled again and said, "The Lord has taken them as his own." The sheriff ordered a search of the house. Deputies scoured the cellar, the attic, the narrow rooms. In the cellar they found chains fixed to the walls, iron rings with frayed rope still tied. In a corner, a wooden box no larger than a coffin, its lid bolted shut. Inside were scraps of cloth stiff with dried blood. The deputies swore they heard a faint humming in the air, though no one spoke. In the attic, they found cubbies with small straw pallets, each just large enough for a child to curl into. The shutters were locked from the outside. One deputy pried one open and swore the wood was clawed with fingernail marks. Still, no graves were found. No bodies, no bones, no clear proof of death. And without proof, the law's hands were tied. Elizabeth was taken into custody on suspicion of cruelty and neglect, but she carried herself to the jail with serene composure, as though she were the one escorting them. Her followers scattered, some slipping away in the night, others captured but denying all wrongdoing. The children were placed in the care of local families, but something about them unnerved even the kindest hands. They refused to speak, even when coaxed with food or comfort. They sat for hours, rocking gently, humming under their breath in low, identical tones. One woman who took in 2 of the girls claimed she awoke at night to find them kneeling beside her bed, their lips moving silently as if reciting words she could not hear. The trial began in March of 1829, and the courthouse was crowded with those who had long whispered of Elizabeth Crane's orphanage. Witnesses came forward, farmers, ministers, travelers, each adding fuel to the fire. They spoke of pale children in the orchard, of chanting in the night, of disappearances and scars. The most damning testimony came from Jacob Miller, the bee farmhand who had spied on the orchard ritual. Under oath, he swore he had seen the children bound and kneeling, the adults chanting, the candles extinguished. His trembling voice filled the chamber, and for the first time Elizabeth's composure cracked. When asked directly where the missing children had gone, she replied, "Their bodies were too stained for burial. The earth would not have them. They were given back to the fire, and in flame they found purity." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The sheriff demanded clarification. Did she mean cremation? Sacrifice? Elizabeth only smiled, her gray eyes unblinking. "The world clings to flesh," she said, "but flesh is weakness. I freed them of it." Her words sealed her fate. She was convicted not of murder, for no bodies were found, but of neglect and cruelty, sentenced to life in confinement. Yet even in chains, she seemed unbroken. When led from the courthouse, she turned to the crowd and said, "The silence remains. You may scatter them, but the silence remains." Her followers fared differently. Dr. Nathaniel Prothero fled before he could be tried, vanishing into the mountains. Some said he took with him notebooks filled with his experiments. Others believed he slipped into another county, changed his name, and continued his work. The women of her circle were given lesser sentences, most serving only a handful of years before disappearing into obscurity. But the children, they were the true tragedy of the Crane case. Though placed in homes across the valley, most never recovered. Few ever spoke again. Some wasted away within months, as though their silence ate at their very bones. Others grew into adulthood but were marked by strangeness, muttering to themselves, humming at odd hours, staring into corners as if waiting for someone unseen. A handful vanished entirely, leaving their foster families behind without a trace. And always, the orchard stood. Though the house itself was torn down after Elizabeth's imprisonment, the orchard remained, its trees blooming unnaturally early, its soil refusing to yield crops. Locals swore the ground carried a hum at night, faint but insistent, as though 23 voices still whispered beneath it. The official record closed with Elizabeth Crane's confinement in Richmond's asylum, where she remained until her death in 1836. The report of her passing listed only complications of the lungs. She was buried in an unmarked grave on asylum grounds, her name forgotten by the state. But in Augusta County, her story lingered, stitched into the fabric of the valley like a stain that will not wash out. For though the trial had ended, the silence of the children remained. No graves were ever found. No proof of their deaths was ever uncovered. They had simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers, scars, and the echo of humming in the orchard. And in that silence lay the horror, not of what was seen, but of what was never found. The collapse of Elizabeth Crane Silent Orphanage was not a single moment, not one cataclysmic night of discovery that shattered the facade. It was slower, stranger, like the sound of beams groaning before a roof caves in. There had been whispers for years, questions raised in town meetings, subtle warnings hidden in letters from traveling ministers who had been denied entry into the estate. But it was not until the spring of 1819 that the suspicions hardened into action. And as with so many great revelations, it began not with the powerful, but with the powerless. A young girl, her name lost to history, though some believe it was, Margaret, stumbled into the town of Hallows Rest barefoot, thin as a wraith, her hair matted, her eyes wide with a silence that screamed louder than any cry. She carried no belongings, no explanation, only a thin strip of linen wrapped tightly around her wrist, a strip marked faintly with the embroidered initials EC. When questioned, she said almost nothing. Only one phrase passed her lips, whispered over and over like a curse. "The cellar is full." That phrase reached the ears of Reverend James Whitford, the same reverend who years earlier had doubted Crane's methods but lacked the proof to challenge her directly. He visited the girl, pressed her gently for answers, but each time she withdrew into silence, rocking back and forth until her body shook. Still, the seed had been planted. Word spread quickly through taverns and pulpits that something more sinister than neglect lingered behind the gates of the orphanage. It was the county magistrate, Samuel Hargrove, who finally acted. A man of stern convictions, hardened by the memory of his own daughter lost in infancy, Hargrove had always viewed Elizabeth Crane's work with a mixture of admiration and unease. Now faced with the testimony of the girl, he ordered an inquiry. Court documents from May of 1819 record his words, "Where children are concerned, silence is not protection, but damnation. We shall enter and seek the truth." On June 3rd, accompanied by a small party of deputies and Reverend Whitford, Hargrove approached the iron gates of the orphanage. What awaited them was not resistance but an eerie stillness. The grounds were unkempt, grass grown long, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. Windows, once polished by Crane's insistence on order, hung open and broken. No laughter, no singing, only silence. Elizabeth Crane herself greeted them at the entrance. Witnesses describe her as composed, though her clothing hung looser on her frame than in years past, her hair streaked with more gray, her eyes, once burning with conviction, distant, hollow. "You come too late," she told them. "The work is done." Inside, the investigators found the orphanage in decay, dormitories lined with empty beds, their sheets stiff with dust, classrooms stripped of chalk and books as though abandoned in haste. Yet it was the cellar that revealed the true horror. Accounts differ on who descended first, but all agree that the air grew heavier with each step downward, a sour, sweet rot clinging to the walls. The cellar was no longer a place of storage but a tomb. 23 small bodies, wrapped not in coffins but in thin shrouds of burlap, lay stacked along the walls. Some were buried shallowly in the earthen floor, others left exposed, their faces still visible in the dim lantern light. Not one grave marker, not one prayer, just silence. The girl's words had been true. The cellar was full. Reverend Whitford collapsed to his knees in prayer while Hargrove reportedly shouted at Crane, demanding answers. Her reply was maddeningly calm. They were chosen. Their voices would carry into eternity. You cannot bury a hymn. The deputies arrested her, on the spot binding her wrists with rope. But even in chains, she never wept, never begged, never cursed. She carried herself as though she were not a prisoner, but a prophet misunderstood. The days that followed brought chaos to Hollow's Rest. News of the orphanage's secret spread like fire. Families who had once donated coin and food now rioted outside the courthouse demanding justice. Mothers who had entrusted their children to Crane tore at their hair and beat their chests, screaming for her blood. Men with torches stalked the roads, searching for any surviving member of her society, though none were ever found. The trial of Elizabeth Crane began in July of 1819 and drew crowds from across the county. The courtroom overflowed, every bench filled, windows crammed with faces peering in. The charges were grim: neglect, unlawful burial, and, though not officially named, murder. Yet what made the trial unforgettable was not the evidence, which was undeniable, but Crane's testimony. She spoke for hours, not in defense but in sermons. Her words twisted the scripture, bending it into something unrecognizable. Children, she declared, are the purest vessels. Their suffering is not cruelty, it is offering. Their silence is not absence, it is song. I did not kill them. I delivered them to eternity. Court transcripts record gasps, sobs, even fainting among the women in the gallery. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, yet Crane continued, her voice rising like a preacher at revival, her thin frame shaking with conviction. To some, she appeared deranged, to others disturbingly convincing. Then came the witnesses. Servants who had once worked in the orphanage described ceremonies held at night, children led into the cellar and never seen again. One boy, now grown, testified that he had been forced to drink bitter tonics that left him sick for days. A midwife swore she had seen Crane writing letters to unseen correspondents, describing the perfecting of silence through pain. Each testimony built a darker picture until even the most sympathetic could no longer deny the horror. And yet, despite the evidence, no official cause of death could be determined for the children. Some bodies showed signs of malnutrition, others bore marks that could have been restraints, yet there was no clear proof of violence. It was this lack of certainty that kept the jury in debate for days. Was Crane a murderer, or simply a zealot, who let her charges waste away? On July 28th, the verdict was delivered. Elizabeth Crane was found guilty of gross neglect and unlawful burial, but not murder. The sentence: life imprisonment at Coldwater Penitentiary, a stone fortress miles away from Hollow's Rest. As the verdict was read, Crane did not cry. She did not speak. She simply lowered her head as though bowing in prayer. But the story did not end with her imprisonment. For as she was led away, a group of women, followers perhaps, or simply those touched by her words, stood outside the courthouse and sang a hymn. The same hymn, it was said, that the orphans were made to sing in the orphanage halls. Their voices were quiet, trembling, but carried on the wind like a curse. And then came the greatest mystery of all: the bodies. Though the authorities ordered them interred in the churchyard marked with proper stones, by the time gravediggers returned to collect them, the cellar was empty. 23 bodies vanished without a trace. Some claimed Crane's followers had stolen them in the night. Others whispered darker things. That Wilton's journal was dismissed as the paranoid rambling of an overzealous preacher. But in the absence of other answers, many returned to his words. If Elizabeth Crane was not merely cruel, but a true occultist, then perhaps the absence of graves was intentional. Perhaps burial was never her aim. By the 1850s, the Crane Orphanage had become a place of urban legend. Teenagers dared each other to break into the ruins. Farmers claimed their livestock refused to graze near the northern boundary fence. Even travelers passing through the county wrote of strange feelings when approaching the road that led to the estate. A Philadelphia journalist visiting the site in 1856 described the grounds as unnaturally still, where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. and the air itself is heavier than it ought to be. Local lawmen warned him against staying too long, claiming that those who lingered near the orphanage for more than an hour would later report waking in the night to the sound of children whispering in their own homes. It was also around this time that rumors began to spread of figures being seen at the windows, figures too small to be Elizabeth, too small to be any adult at all, shadows shaped like children, moving in the abandoned halls, sometimes just standing still, watching. And though the house had been condemned for decades, some swore they saw faces peering out from the broken glass, pale and hollow-eyed, framed by the remnants of curtains that had long since rotted away. But the most unsettling mysteries were not the sightings, nor the whispers, nor even the fragmented bones. It was the matter of the 23 names. The children who had entered the Crane Orphanage were registered by the county. Each name was written, each child accounted for. And yet when descendants and archivists later sought to trace them, they found that almost every official record had vanished. Baptism papers, birth ledgers, and parish notes all missing. It was as if the children had been erased from existence, their very identities swallowed by the silence of Elizabeth's shadow. Some families claimed their children had been taken in by Crane, but could no longer prove it. Others insisted they had received letters supposedly written by Elizabeth, assuring them the children were alive and well. These letters, however, bore postmarks that could not be verified, and handwriting that shifted subtly from one to the next. By the end of the century, not one bloodline could claim with evidence descent from the Crane Orphanage. The children had simply vanished. Not just their bodies, but their names, their records, their place in history. Gone. And so, the stories began to change. Perhaps Elizabeth Crane had not been fully human at all. Perhaps she had been something else. Something that fed on children, not in flesh alone, but in spirit. An old tale, whispered in back rooms and kitchens, claimed that she had learned how to drain the innocence from a child, to pull the life force out like thread from fabric and weave it into herself. Her unnaturally long life, her eyes that some swore looked younger than her years, her strength even in captivity, all of it seemed to suggest she had taken something from those 23 children and made it her own. Not death, but transference. Not graves, but consumption. A horror older than scripture and science combined. Yet despite the theories, the orphanage remained. It stood long after Elizabeth's bones were laid in the cold earth, long after the court had turned its attention elsewhere, long after the family stopped asking questions. It became a landmark, a haunted relic, a reminder of what silence can hide. And in that silence, perhaps, the children still linger. Not in marked graves, not in the ground, but in the walls, in the floors, in the wind that rattles the broken windows at night. Forever unburied, forever nameless, forever lost. And that is perhaps the greatest horror of the Crane Orphanage. Not the trial, not the rumors, not even Elizabeth herself. But the fact that to this day, 23 children remain unaccounted for. No graves, no stones, no names carved in wood. Only silence. The silence of children who should have lived, but instead were swallowed whole by the shadow of a woman who called herself their guardian. And as the years passed, that silence grew heavier, a weight pressing down on the land, a reminder to every passerby. Some absences cannot be filled. Some names cannot be remembered, because they were never allowed to be written. And some evils once committed never truly fade. The Silent Orphanage remains a scar not only on the land where it once stood, but on the collective memory of those who have studied it. By the 1840s, long after Elizabeth Crane had been confined to the asylum in Danvers, Massachusetts, the building itself was abandoned. Nature began its slow reclamation. The roof caved in from snow and neglect. Windows were smashed by vagrants. The iron gates rusted and fell into the soil. And yet, even as the walls collapsed, people whispered that the land was still alive with voices. Farmers who cut across the overgrown lot spoke of hearing children singing nursery hymns in tones so faint, it seemed as though the wind itself was carrying them. Hunters swore they saw small figures darting between the trees at dusk, always barefoot, always silent, The ruin was eventually cleared in the early 1900s, but no archaeologist, no church committee, no passing historian, ever uncovered a grave. 23 children had entered Elizabeth Crane's care. Not one of them has ever been accounted for. What haunts scholars and locals alike is not simply the absence of evidence, but the presence of suggestion. In the archives of the New Hampshire Historical Society rests a box labeled simply Crane Papers. Inside are fragments, charred at the edges as if rescued from a fire. One page, written in Elizabeth's sharp, slanting hand, reads, "Their voices are not extinguished. Their bodies may wither, but the spirit remains. I have been chosen to carry them beyond hunger, beyond cruelty. The world would let them rot. I will not." Whether these words are the ravings of a delusional woman or the chilling manifesto of a cult leader is still debated. But the outcome is undeniable. Children vanished into her custody and were never seen again. The aftermath of the Crane scandal left deep ripples in American society. New Hampshire passed stricter regulations for orphanages and religious homes, requiring community oversight and record-keeping. Yet enforcement was often weak. In small towns where isolation and faith carried greater weight than law, institutions could operate in secrecy for years before being questioned. Some historians argue that Elizabeth Crane's legacy influenced later movements, those who cloaked cruelty in piety, who used the language of salvation to justify control, and who preyed on society's most vulnerable under the mask of benevolence. But perhaps the most unsettling question remains: where did the children go? Without graves, without bones, without even a shred of clothing found on the grounds, theories multiplied. Some believed she burned the bodies in the large brick furnace attached to the orphanage, a furnace meant originally for heating during New England winters. Others suspected mass burial in the swamps behind the property, where thick mud could conceal remains for centuries. Still others clung to darker possibilities, that Elizabeth and her followers conducted rituals meant not merely to kill, but to transform, to bind the children's essence into something eternal. When researchers in the 1970s brought ground-penetrating equipment to the site, they discovered anomalies beneath the soil, voids, disturbed earth, patterns too deliberate to be natural. And yet, when digging commenced, nothing was recovered. No bones, no coffins, no proof. Just soil that seemed recently turned, though more than a century had passed. Local folklore insists that Elizabeth Crane was not acting alone. Diaries of townsfolk mention figures coming and going from the orphanage, late at night, hooded, carrying bundles. One surviving testimony from a man named Josiah Pelham describes hearing chants in the distance, low and sorrowful, like the voices of mothers weeping. He claimed to have seen torches moving in procession from the orphanage into the woods, but when he approached, the lights blinked out as if swallowed by the trees. Whether these accounts were exaggerations fueled by fear or the shadows of a greater conspiracy remains unknown. The Crane name has faded into obscurity, erased from official records where possible, but echoes of it still surface. Genealogical. Researchers found traces of relatives who changed their surnames and fled New England, carrying with them whispered shame. Yet others may have embraced her vision, carrying forward her doctrines into secret enclaves. In the late 19th century, a pamphlet appeared in Boston titled "The Silent Way, a Treatise on the Innocent Soul," bearing eerie resemblance to Elizabeth's known writings. Its author was anonymous, its publisher untraceable. Only 50 copies are known to exist, but in them the same disturbing philosophy emerges, that the young must be delivered from the corruption of flesh and lifted into eternal silence. Even in the present day, strange events surround the land where the orphanage once stood. Campers have reported hearing soft knocking on the trunks of trees at night, as though small fists were tapping for attention. Paranormal investigators claim recordings capture faint lullabies sung in a child's voice, though the woods are empty. And in one chilling account from 2009, a woman walking her dog reported seeing a group of children in old-fashioned clothing standing at the tree line watching her without expression. When she blinked, they were gone. As with all tragedies cloaked in time, the truth of Elizabeth Crane's orphanage may never be known. But perhaps what makes the story endure is not just the horror of the children's disappearance, but the unease it plants in us about institutions themselves. How often have we trusted orphanages, schools, churches, or asylums simply because they wear the mask of care? How often have families handed over their most vulnerable to strangers cloaked in piety, never questioning what truly happens behind closed doors? Elizabeth Crane reminds us of a darker possibility, that evil does not always arrive with horns and fire, but sometimes with a smile, a prayer, and a promise of salvation. In the end, the lesson is as much about us as it is about her. What blindness allowed 23 children to vanish without a grave? What silence permitted neighbors, church leaders, and local officials to ignore the signs until it was too late? And most hauntingly, what echoes of that silence still live in our world today? When we turn away from suffering, when we bury our suspicions, when we trust too blindly, do we not become, in some small way, disciples of the same silence that Elizabeth Crane preached? Perhaps the ground where the orphanage stood will never yield its secrets. Perhaps those 23 children will remain unmarked, their voices forever woven into the wind that sweeps across that lonely patch of earth. But their absence should haunt us. It should remind us that history is not simply a record of dates and names, but a warning carved into our collective memory. We must never forget that the line between faith and fanaticism, between care and cruelty, between devotion and horror is far thinner than we wish to believe, and so, the story of Elizabeth Crane's Silent Orphanage lingers, an open wound in the soil of New Hampshire, a shadow on the conscience of America. 23 children entered her care. Not one left a grave, not one left a name on stone. Only silence remains, stretching across centuries, whispering in the night for those willing to listen. If you found yourself unsettled by this tale, remember, the past is not as distant as it seems. The horrors of yesterday have a way of echoing into tomorrow. Stories like this are not merely about ghosts and lost souls. They are about vigilance, about the dangers of misplaced trust, and about the fragile veil that separates good intentions from monstrous acts. Do not let their silence be forgotten. Share this story. Speak their names, though history has erased them. And the next time you see an abandoned building or hear the faint laughter of children where none should be, ask yourself, what stories lie buried there waiting to be uncovered? This was Elizabeth Crane's Silent Orphanage. 23 children and not a single grave marked. If you want more forgotten histories, more unsettling truths buried in America's past, then join us here, subscribe, and step with us into the shadows. Because some stories demand to be remembered no matter how much they terrify us.